From the city of broad shoulders, this is Chicago Unscripted with CBS News Chicago's Joe Donlon.
One of my favorite things about this show is exploring the Chicago experience with people who have lived it. And my guest today has lived it. Jim Williams spent 47 years in the media here, first at WGN, then with ABC News, where he worked alongside the likes of Peter Jennings and Ted Koppel, and the back nine of his career, which he spent at CBS News Chicago. Along the way, he also worked as the press secretary for Mayor Richard M. Daley. We get into why he struggled with the decision to make that detour, and armed with that knowledge, what advice he has for the current mayor, Brandon Johnson. Jim grew up on the South Side as a Cubs fan because most of the black players lived on the South Side back then, right down the street from him. You'll hear how that shaped his love of baseball and the Cubs, and his thoughts about the current state of the South Side, the poverty, the abandoned houses, the crime, the food deserts, and what he thinks needs to happen to turn things around. Jim just stepped away from his full-time duties at CBS News Chicago. I've had the honor of working with him for the past 3 years. What we should all take away from what you're about to hear is something he touches on more than once, and something he made a point of saying when he signed off: how quickly time passes. The clock on the wall holds dominion over all. And as the clock strikes midnight on his career, he has some thoughts on his sojourn through the years that have flown by. I always loved stopping by Jim's desk and picking his brain, tapping into his vast knowledge of Chicago history, culture, and music, much of which goes back to his days working as an Andy Frain usher as a teenager at some of the biggest venues and most memorable shows, concerts, and plays in the city. He's had a front row seat to a lot of what's happened here in the past 50 years, and I can tell you he is universally loved and respected in every Chicago newsroom. He's one of the nicest guys you'll meet in the business. You've heard people say he's one of those guys you like to have a beer with. Well, we may not be at a pub, but this is the next best thing. Here's Jim Williams. JW, great to see you. How are you?
Great to see you, Joe, always.
Yeah. How's it going? You miss us yet?
I do. I miss the troops. I miss the work, but I miss the troops. Yes. I mean, I became, close friends with so many people in our newsroom. It's a great newsroom. And so I miss the camaraderie and the conversation. I miss seeing you and talking to you every day. It was always a highlight of the day. So yeah, I miss it. I do.
You're kind. Yeah, I do as well. And we'll get into some of the many things we've discussed over the 3 years I was fortunate enough to work with you. But what are you doing now? I mean, we should point out too that you're not retired, not fully retired. You're, what do you call it? Like
fully retired? No,
semi-retired, because you're going to do some work for us, right?
Yeah, I'm going to try to do 2 to 4 stories a month for the station. I have one set up for next week or sometime in the next week.
Right.
So I'm going to try to stay busy and keep the brain from atrophying.
What brought you to the decision, Jim? At what point did you say, okay, was this sudden? Was it something that you've been thinking about for the last few years?
No, it's something I've been thinking about for the last year. On my last day of the station as a full-time employee was January 16th. And that was the end of my 3-year contract. So when we started the 4 o'clock news in 2022, they said, we'd like to sign you to a 3-year contract. Do you think you can work that entire contract considering my age? And I was determined to do that. So the last day of the contract was the 16th. And I had been talking to my wife for about a year that I think this is it as a full-time employee.
Wow, that's interesting. They asked you, do you think you can make it through? You're not that old, Jim.
Well, I just turned 68 a week ago. So I'm at the age where, you start thinking about hanging it up. I didn't want to be the old guy being shown the door, so.
Well, we're all shown the door at some point in this business, aren't we?
That happens in this business, right? I didn't want to wear out my welcome. And I thought this was the right time. My wife has after a very fine career as an executive in HR, hung it up a while ago, and she's working a part-time job now just to do it, just for fun, the fun of it. I thought this is the right time in my life to hang up the full-time work.
Yeah, I mean, you sold. I had an idea when you sold your place in the South Loop and then bought the place out in Geneva, right? You're in Geneva,
right, yeah.
That you were probably winding it down. So what are you going to do? Like, what do you like to do when, my kids are always on me. They're like, Dad, you'd be miserable if you were retired. What would you do? Walk the Lakeshore Trail? You do that every day. What do you want to do with your time?
I work out every day. I have to really watch my health.
Mm-hmm.
Got a couple of health challenges. I have to do that. And, I try to keep my mind active. I'm reading books and staying on top of the news. I still care about the news every day. I read it every day. And, that'll never go away. And just trying to see friends. My wife and I just got back from Florida, visiting friends there. And socialization, as we know, as we get older, becomes really important to keep the brain active and fresh. And so I'm doing that. And sleep. I had been getting up at 5:30 in the morning. I'm not doing that, Joe. I I'm sleeping in a little bit, but still getting up and at 'em as early as I can.
We've lost a lot of people in this market, Jim, to retirement. Big names. You have worked with many of them. I was thinking about this the other day. The Tom Skillings and the Dan Roans, and I mean almost every male anchor in the market has retired recently. With Krzyzewski at 7 and Rob Stafford at NBC and Corey McFerrin at Fox. Not to mention, the class before that with the Ron Majors and Carol Marines and. What kind of a toll do you think that takes on the media in a city like this?
Well, you're losing a lot of institutional memory, people who've been around for the last 30 and 40 years and can put stories that happen today in some kind of historical context. So, you're missing a lot when those people leave. But it's funny, this generation is reached a point, as I said to you, and I said on the air on my last day, I was at one time, and it doesn't seem that long ago, Joe, that I was the youngest person at the television station at WGN when I started in 1977. And now I'm the oldest person at CBS Chicago. And I don't say that to, try to evoke any kind of sympathy, but, it is sobering to think about how quickly time has passed. And so I think, yeah, you obviously missed something when um, it seems like an entire generation is leaving the business at the same time. But on the other hand, the people who are now 30 years old working in our business, one day, if they're fortunate, they'll be around for 20, 30 years and they will take the lessons that they've learned and carry it and pass it on to the next generation. So that's just the cycle of life. And, I do think about the fact that I remember when certain people started in our business or started in Chicago. And, that was not in the early 80s and the early 90s. And now we're all walking out at the same time. So it makes you pause, but that's life.
That was a different time, Jim. And I don't know, is it fair to say that was sort of the heyday of media in Chicago? Things have definitely changed. I mean, back then you guys were like rock stars.
Well, things have changed considerably. There's just so many places for people to get information and news. Podcasts are hugely important, as you as you
Mhm.
know. And so many people have blogs, so many people have websites. Surveys indicate that people have less trust in the news media than they had 10 years ago. And
Right.
we have to find a way to adapt to these changes. Yeah. And when I started in the business, there was no cable television to speak of. You didn't have, we had 4 channels in Chicago that offered news on a daily basis. And now think of all the neighborhoods in Chicago that have their own Facebook pages and
Hmm.
how many suburban communities have their own Facebook page and ways to get information. So that, it's never been more competitive than it is now. Things have changed considerably. We're all fighting for the same smaller piece of the pie.
Right. I mean, back then you guys were the voice of the city, and now everyone has a megaphone, essentially.
Everyone has a megaphone. Think about the website and the X feed crime in Chicago. The crime Wrigleyville in Chicago website CWB.
Right. Yeah.
They are on top of crime in this city like no other source of news.
Yep.
They routinely beat us to stories, and so I think it's forced us all to reassess how we cover the news, how we present it to the audience, And the competition will, I think, strengthen us on some level.
Yeah, but we've been faced with so many challenges, Jim, and this is not to make excuses, but we've all had cutbacks, and we're, sort of a shell of what we used to be as far as manpower in the newsroom. And people watching, may not realize or may question. I got an email the other day from a woman, saying, "Why aren't you covering this and why aren't you covering that?" And we are facing a number of challenges, not the least of which, and maybe some of this is exacerbated by the fact that, the point that you just brought up, which is the people have lost a lot of trust in the media. What do we do about that, Jim? Because, the other day I had a woman come up to me and she didn't know who I was, but she said, "Oh, you work at CBS, right?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "You're the fake news." And I'm thinking, wow. And this was in another city. It's just, we're facing a lot of headwinds. And I always remember the former FCC chairman, Newt Minow, told me, reporters should be skeptical, but not cynical. And I don't think there's even almost a place for reporters being skeptical these days.
No, and there are some people who resent critical examinations of an issue or people, or programs. And all we can do, Joe, is continue to do our work and do it with integrity, do it with honesty, try to be fair to different points of view and different people, and that's all we can do. And also watch our behavior on social media, because we can get carried away like anybody else and use language that's inappropriate, or we can certainly display our biases in a way that will turn people off. We have to be really diligent and really careful. And it's also a time of great opportunity because there are so many channels for us to use to get information to folks. We can't lose our integrity and our good judgment.
Yeah. You had the great benefit, having worked in this market, of being born here.
Right.
I want to get into some of your early days down on the South Side. And one of the things that always stands out to me, you and I were talking about the South Side, and I want to get into some of that too later. But you told me you were a Cubs fan because a lot of the black players lived near you down on the South Side. That's how it was back in the day.
That's how it was back in the day, because people will often ask me, "How did you grow up in West Chatham as a Cubs fan, not a Sox fan?" I didn't dislike the White Sox. So I always wanted to see the White Sox do well. They were 1A. Cubs were 1.
Mm-hmm.
Because in large part, we were exposed to the black players on the Cubs when we were kids. Ernie Banks lived in Chatham. Billy Williams, before he moved out to the suburbs, lived on the South Side. Fergie Jenkins lived on the South Side. And because these people were your neighbors, and in some cases were good to the little leagues and the other organizations on the South Side, they were our friends and our neighbors. And this is a time of great segregation. Now today, Michael Jordan just sold a house in Highland Park, but he lived in the northern suburbs. Various Bears live around the Lake Forest area. It wasn't like that in Chicago in the 1960s. The black players, even the ones who played at Addison and Clark on the north side, lived on the south side because that's where they were welcome. So, I was a Cub fan, and still am to this day. And although I hope the White Sox can pull themselves out of where they've been the last.
Yeah. Who's your favorite Cub? Did you have interactions with any of them while
Ernie
you were
Banks. I
growing
met
up?
Ernie Banks when I was 10 years old. He lived across the street from my mother's dear friend, Francis Miner. They taught in the Chicago Public Schools together. And one afternoon, Ernie Banks was in his backyard playing with his kids. And Mrs. Miner said, "Hey, Ernie, I've got some friends over here who are big fans. They want to say hello." And Ernie Banks, without hesitation, left his backyard, bounced across the street with a big smile on his face, and just couldn't have been nicer. Imagine the impact that would have on a 10-year-old kid.
Yeah. Yeah. So he still remains your favorite to this day?
Ernie Banks. I love Ron Santo. I got to interview Ron Santo when I was in my early days at Channel 2. His son did a documentary on his dad called This Old Cub, a very poignant, I don't know if you've ever seen that or not, but really poignant documentary. And so I got to interview Ron Santo and his son. And the first and only time in my career, I actually told a subject, "I love you."
Oh, wow.
I said, I loved Ron Santo. I loved all those Cubs, Glenn Beckert and Don Kessinger and Randy Huntley and Fergie Jenkins and Ken Holtzman, all those guys were heroes when I was a kid.
That must have been something that just came out. You couldn't have been thinking about saying
No,
that, right?
I wasn't thinking about it. I talked about one memorable memory I had of Ron Santo. This was actually, I saw this in person on July 4th, 1973. He hit a walk-off home run in the bottom of the ninth inning. We were down 2-1. Glenn Becker was on base, and Ron Santo hit a 2-run homer in the bottom of the ninth to win the game for the Cubs. And I said, "Do you remember what happened on July 4th, 1973?" He didn't remember, but I refreshed his memory, and the "I love you" just came out.
Yeah.
Perhaps was not the most professional thing for a reporter to do with a subject, but I couldn't help myself.
Yeah. Well, while we're here, Jim, let's go ahead and talk about this, because this was one of the conversations you and I had along the way that really stood out to me. And I think it just sort of came up. I had done a few stories on the South Side, and I asked you your thoughts on what you think happened on the South Side and why it's in the situation it's in now. And to preface that, I had done a series of stories down there on, vacant, abandoned, boarded up houses. And I think I walked away from there with a sort of new appreciation for what people on the South Side are faced with. And I think it's a situation that people on the North Side maybe look at as kind of out of sight, out of mind. If you took someone from a well-resourced North Side neighborhood and dropped them into Roseland or Chatham or, Englewood or back of the yards, I think they'd be there for maybe 5 minutes and say, what in the world is going on down here?
It's a very complicated, very complex situation, Joe. I mean, there's, companies have left the city, manufacturing jobs that were once plentiful, especially for folks coming up to Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and the great migration from the South. A lot of those jobs are gone. And, there's just been enormous economic disinvestment. And I think one of the other factors, and you and I have discussed this, that people don't pay as much attention to, is the fact that when I was growing up in West Chatham, you had economic diversity in the community. It was an all-Black community, but you had economic diversity. You had teachers and social workers and lawyers and insurance agents living next to people who worked in factories, or people who swept floors, people who drove buses, people who worked for streets and sanitation. And they were in one neighborhood or a handful of neighborhoods because they were not welcome in other places. I mean, Chicago was so deeply segregated. We were just talking about the Chicago Cubs who lived on the South Side. Well, think about today where we're spread out. There's been the economic foundation in these communities is not the same as it was 34 years ago, in large part because people have more opportunities to live in other places. So folks who might have lived in Chatham or Auburn Gresham, or name the community on the South Side, people who might have lived there 40, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, are now living in Flossmoor and Homewood and Oak Park and Evanston and Glenview, Naperville. And so you don't have the same concentration of money that you once had. And it's all led to some very serious problems.
What do you see as a solution down on the South Side, Jim? I mean, again, if you extrapolate this, schools have been closed in a number of areas. And as you said, there's very little economic development. There are food deserts. There's little investment. There's little hope. And I think that's a big part of it. But I mean, you can go to as diverse as Chicago is, it's still pretty segregated. I mean, and that's where a lot of people who are addressing these things think maybe integration is a big part of at least trying to turn the corner.
Well, you have to have economic integration. It's not just racial integration. You have to have people who have means, who are contributing to these communities, who are being mentors to the kids, who are supporting the institutions that are doing all they can to create vibrant communities. All of us have to be involved on some level, whether or not you donate to a charity, or you mentor a child, or you support a social agency that is doing what it can. It's not just, people want to say, you hear this all the time. Why don't Black folks just pull themselves up by the bootstraps? And why doesn't the Black community do this or that? It takes all of us. It's going to take all of us, and it's going to And we all have to be invested and all have to understand we are connected to one another on some level. Even if you live in an affluent suburban community, you have to be involved with people who live in other places and need our help. It's not the government's responsibility. It's not the responsibility of a single community. It's going to take all of us.
Hmm. You mentioned, it's interesting you mentioned that. I had interviewed Professor Dexter Voisin. I don't know if you remember him from the University of Chicago, but he said exactly that a lot of people say, just pick yourself up by your bootstraps. And he said in many cases, they not only don't have boots, they don't have straps.
That's straps, right? That's right. And imagine if you live in an area that's depressed, where the schools are not great, where there's enormous poverty, where there are food deserts, where you are surrounded by people who are struggling. What would your life be like? What would it's very easy to compare your life when you've been fortunate and you've had great parents, devoted parents, people with means. And I'm not just talking about wealthy folks, but a solid middle class upbringing. It's very easy for you to pass judgment on people who have not grown up the way you've grown up. And so I think it's going to require enormous empathy and support and involvement in these communities.
A big part of your life, Jim, is something you and I talk a lot about, and that was your days, your days as an Andy Frain usher. Tell us a little bit about how that came to be, and how long you worked for them, because it really truly was sort of a formative job for you, right, in your life.
I can link everything that I've done in my career as a reporter to my time at Andy Frain, because for folks who don't know, Andy Frain was a company in Chicago that provided ushers to every major venue in Chicago. So we had ushers at Wrigley Field and Comiskey Park and Soldier Field and the Auditorium Theater, the Orchestra Hall and the International Amphitheater. I worked as an usher, anything from Led Zeppelin to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the Bears to wrestling at the International Amphitheater, roller derby. I mean, every conceivable group I crossed paths with, in this city. Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, poor, rich, down-to-earth folks and snobs. And so if think about what we do as reporters, we interact with all sorts of people, and we have to know how to communicate with them. And I learned that at 16, 17 years old. So it was a remarkable experience. I'm sorry that a lot of kids don't have that same experience today that I had at 16 and 17 years old, because you really learn how to get along. You learn how to be persuasive. You learn how to be diplomatic when you need to be diplomatic. And it was just a great experience.
You were able to touch a lot of cultural corners of Chicago that you might not have otherwise had access to.
There's no question. I mean, I worked Led Zeppelin's last appearance in Chicago. Okay. I worked Chicago Symphony Orchestra concerts with Sir George Schulte. As an Andy Frain chief usher, I worked Richard J. Daley's funeral. And then 15 years later, ended up working for his son. I mean, think about that. And here's the thing about Richard J. Daley's death. The Saturday before he died, he attended an event at the Auditorium Theater. I think it was a benefit for St. Ignatius High School. Bob Hope was the MC. I held the door open for Mayor Richard J. Daley, and then later the next week worked his funeral. I mean, I worked a dinner that Daley had for Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt. I mean, think about the things that I was exposed to as a kid. It's really remarkable that I had that experience at 16 years old.
But that probably really helped foster your love of music too, because you really do have a wide swath of music that I know you love and appreciate. Springsteen's your favorite, right? What was the favorite concert you worked as?
Springsteen's my favorite. I love Pat Metheny, the great jazz guitarist. Yeah. I loved Marvin Gaye, love Al Green and Aretha and Joni Mitchell. And yeah, I have pretty eclectic taste in music.
Were you able to see any of them as an usher at a show?
I worked Al Green. I worked James Brown. I worked Earth, Wind and Fire. I worked The Who.
Pink Floyd. Didn't you do Pink Floyd?
I worked a Pink Floyd concert at Soldier Field in 1977. They oversold the venue. I mean, there must have been 75,000 people, and there were people climbing up the side of Soldier Field to get into the show. I mean, that's how desperate people were to see Pink Floyd. And yes, I worked Pink Floyd. I worked Ted Nugent. I worked
Hmm.
Deep Purple and Uriah Heep and the Doobie Brothers. I mean, just one I can name, one after another.
Wow. And I think that probably also, tell me if I'm wrong, it created the love you have now of the theater.
Well, I've loved the theater for a long time, but yeah, I mean, that certainly was a big thing for me to do or to see when I was working for Andy Frayne. I mean, I remember working Hello Dolly at the Erie Crown Theater and Fiddler on the Roof. Must have worked 25 performances of that at the Erie Crown Theater. Yeah, so um, I was just exposed to an awful lot at a young age.
Favorite venue?
I would say the Auditorium Theater. I was the chief usher there, and so long ago, Joe. I worked at Bruce Springsteen's first big tour was when Born to Run came out,
Mm-hmm.
1975, and I worked his show in Chicago at the Auditorium in the fall of '75. Bruce Springsteen, show you how long ago this was. Bruce Springsteen was 26 years old. He's younger than my daughter is now. 26, he just turned 26 years old. He's 75 now. When I think, again, when I think about the passage of time, the swift passage of time, it makes me shake my head.
Let's talk about your career. You started at WGN, and this is sort of one of those, mail room to success stories, right? I mean, you basically sort of begged your way in there, didn't you?
I started at WGN in 1977, so 47 and a half years ago. I was the film librarian. It was so long ago, Joe, that we were covering news at WGN with 16 millimeter cameras. And I just tell people how that was, or remind those who, lived through that, but don't remember how we cover the news. You shot a story on film. A courier would pick up the film from the cameraman, rush it to a developing house. It would be developed, take about 45 minutes. That person would take the film then to the station, the courier, and an editor would sit at a board at a desk and physically cut the film and put it all together. My job, once the film was on the air, was to take the film and put it where people could find it if they needed it for a future story. So I was the film librarian, and I did that for 2 years, and then moved over to WGN Radio as a news writer. I was fortunate; people were very kind to me there and taught me how to write news. And this is while I was in college at Columbia College, and I learned how to write radio newscasts. And so I worked the overnight shift for 13 months, writing 4 newscasts a day for radio and 1 for television, a small headline show for television. And then eventually moved over to television full time and became a writer and a producer before I did my first story on the air.
Which led to your next job, interestingly enough, right? You were covering City Hall and Mayor Daley. And what happened? Was there a news conference that was a little testy, as I recall?
It was an afternoon or morning in Chicago in, I don't know, June of 1992. Chicago, people forget that because we focus so much on crime now, that Chicago almost set a single year murder record in 1992. We had more than 900 murders in Chicago. It was just particularly violent, as it usually is in the summer. And Mayor Daley was at ironically, an anti-violence assembly at an elementary school, and I was covering it. And when it was over, the mayor was outside the school, and all the reporters were gathered around to interview him. And I said, "Mr. Mayor, you've had, I don't remember the number, but you've had 7 murders in the last 3 days. What can the administration do about it?" And he pointed his face got red, and he pointed his finger and he said, "What are you going to do about it? What is your television station going to do about all the violent movies that they show every single day?" And he was on the hot seat at that time. And I went back to the station, put my story together, and I get a call from one of the mayor's top aides, Frank Cruzy, who said, "We'd like to talk to you about becoming the mayor's press secretary." His press secretary, Avis Lavelle, his first press secretary when he was mayor, left City Hall to become Bill Clinton's campaign press secretary when he was running for president. I said, "This is awfully strange. This has come out of, you know, this has come out of nowhere. I never even thought about being a press secretary for a public official. And I've been a reporter only for a few years, and I'm not sure I want to give this up."
And he just yelled at you.
And on the very day he yelled at me. I don't think the two were connected, by the way. I just think it's a coincidence. He needed a press secretary, and they said I was on a short list of people they wanted to talk to. And so I had dinner with Frank, and he spent 2 hours convincing me it would be a great experience. And I was intrigued. And then I had lunch with the mayor for 2 hours where he really didn't interview me. He was just talking about all the things that he wanted to do in the city and how important the work was. I had dinner with Mayor Daley's brother, Bill Daley, and Tim Degnan, and David Axelrod, who went on to become
Obama's
fighting figure with President Obama. And after all of that, I decided that I wouldn't do it, that I didn't want to do it because I had only been a reporter for 6 years, and it was my dream to be a reporter in Chicago, and I didn't want to give it up. They said, "Keep the door cracked open and reconsider, because you can always go back in the television news. Think about the education that you will get here at City Hall. You'll see how the sausage is really made, and then you can take that experience and that knowledge back to reporting, should you choose to do that." And ultimately, Joe, I decided that I was turning down the job because I was scared of it. I knew it was a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week experience. And
you were scared of it because you didn't think you were qualified, or?
Well, I knew there was going to be tremendous pressure in the job, and I did, and I did not think I was qualified. I didn't think I had never done PR, had never worked. And there was a huge management component of it because back in those days, I don't know what it's like now at City Hall, but it was a centralized press operation. So the mayor's press office, headed by the press secretary, was also supervising all the public information officers scattered throughout city government. So the spokesperson in the streets and sanitation department, or the police department, the fire department, name a city department, they had a public information officer. And all those people reported to the mayor's press office and ultimately the press secretary. So there was a big management part of it. And then, I was going from asking questions to answering questions. And I didn't know that I would have the answers about things going on in the administration in a way that would protect the mayor and also give the reporters the information they needed to do their jobs. So it just seemed overwhelming to me, but I decided that was a reason to do the job because it would scare me, and trying to get over your fears is a good thing. That's where growth comes from. And so I did it, and I did it for 5 years. And it was up until that time, was the longest serving mayoral press secretary in Chicago in about 25 years. And it was a tremendous life-changing experience.
Yeah, a friend of mine told me once, and I'll always remember it, if you're not nervous about your next job, you took the wrong job.
Took the wrong job, right. Right.
So it's interesting to me that you say that, Jim, about experience, because I think in the end, a couple of your suggestions or recommendations for Mayor Daley may have come from inexperience, but it's the kind of stuff they teach now in PR schools, which was you need to be A, more friendly, and B, more accessible. And that was a message you pitched to him right away, wasn't it?
Well, let me just say this. The thing that I'm most proud of is that I've seen people, you have seen people who went from journalism to government PR, and they flipped the switch overnight. Suddenly, people who had been colleagues, even friends, became the enemy. And I never approached the job that way. I always, I heard a wise person once say that a good press secretary for a public official protects the press with the boss and protects the boss with the press. And your job is you are paid by the taxpayers, and your job is to make sure that there's accessibility, that there's communication, that you get back to people, that you talk to people, that you're respectful in that process. And sometimes you have to tell the boss, Madam Mayor, Mr. Mayor, Governor, this is what you need to do so that the reporters can do their jobs and provide information to the public. And there are times when you have to, if a reporter has made a mistake on a story, you have to gently correct that mistake, or at least attempt to set the record straight, and do it in a way that does not create hostility between the two of you, because we're public servants. And as corny as that sounds, we are public servants paid by the taxpayers, and we have an obligation to provide information to people in a timely way and not view them as the enemy, not view them as somebody who are folks who are out to destroy us. And so that's what I tried to carry with me in the 5 years that I was in that job. I always thought I'm a reporter at heart. And if I were in their shoes, I would want somebody to be cooperative with me.
When I started at WGN, Jim, Rahm Emanuel was mayor, and he used to just come into the newsroom every now and then and have an off-the-record sit-down chat. You could ask him whatever you wanted. And it seems like those days are gone with Brandon Johnson. It almost feels like kind of an us against them. And I get that to a point, but if you were advising Mayor Johnson today, what would you tell him?
Be a human being and be authentic. And, every conversation you have with a reporter is not a speech. It's not a policy declaration. Sometimes it's just you get to know the people covering you. They get to know you as a human being, as somebody who's just trying every day to do a good job and serve the constituents. Every conversation doesn't have to be adversarial. You don't have to be on the defense. Sometimes you can just talk about movies. Sometimes you can just talk about culture and talk about the Super Bowl. Can you believe the Eagles beat the Chiefs that way? Because those are human interactions, and people start seeing you as a human being, not as a defensive figurehead. And so I would urge him to have casual off the record conversations with reporters. Mayor Daley, before every city council meeting, would go into the city hall press room, and it was all off the record. And the reporters would gather around him, and there were a lot of laughs, a lot of quips, and he would talk about books. What books are you reading? What movies have you seen lately? And people think that's fruitless. There's no reason to do it, because the reporters are always looking to get you. Not necessarily. They're going to ask tough questions, and they're going to try to hold you accountable. But be a human being and be accessible, and everything doesn't require a strategy with your public relations folks and your consultants. So that would be my advice to it.
Did you have any connection with Obama at all? Or were you at that stage in your career so this would have been, 08?
I knew Michelle Obama when she was Michelle Robinson. Worked with her at City Hall. She worked in planning and economic development for Valerie Jarrett, who was the commissioner then.
Right.
And I met her and liked her very much. And that was the year she married Barack Obama. I knew Barack Obama before he was elected to the state Senate in Illinois. He was been a community organizer, and we knew that he was this guy on the rise, and had this incredible background, and was the editor of the Harvard Law Review and all of that. So I remember talking to Valerie Jarrett and I, who went on to work for Obama in a senior role in the White House. She and I worked together in the Daley administration. And I remember talking to Valerie once, and she said, wouldn't it be something if one day Barack Obama might be mayor of Chicago? Mayor of Chicago. Little did we know that he would be elected to the United States Senate and then, the White House. But so yes, I had some interaction with both of them.
It's amazing when you look at not just what Obama did, but the people from Chicago he sort of put on the map. You reminded me of that when you mentioned Valerie Jarrett. But you think about the Valerie Jarretts and the David Axelrods and the Rahm Emanuels and all of the careers that went to really super high places that went directly through Chicago.
I remember when these folks, when Obama could walk down the street, maybe in his own district, and most of the people would know him by face, and I would think about that when he would come back to Chicago as president, and all the plow trucks would be lined up, and the security perimeter put into effect. And I said, this guy, think about that. He once walked down the street unrecognized, and now he has all of this security and all of this attention. And it's remarkable how life can change.
I love talking to you too about your extra role, and I want to know people to hear this story about the Blues Brothers movie and how you ended up as an extra in this.
My father knew the caterer for the Blues Brothers production when it was shot in Chicago in 1979. And this gentleman asked my father, would your son be interested? They're looking for extras. Would your son be interested in being an extra on the Blues Brothers? And of course, I loved the movies and wanted to be a filmmaker at one point in my life. And I said, absolutely, I would love to do that. So I arrived downtown early on I think it was a Saturday, like 7 o'clock in the morning. And they were going to stage the cars, the police cars, the police chase down Lake Street under the L tracks was going to be shot that day. And they needed people on the street watching all this happen. So when those police cars, one after another, crash under these L tracks on Lake Street, I was one of the extras coming out of a store and then ducking when the gunfire started. And if I can show you, if we watch the movie together, I could show you where I am. I'm on the screen. I'm about this big on the screen. But Joe, this is the funny thing about that. So I was on the set for probably 10 hours that day. It got to the point where they crashed so many cars that it was actually boring after a while. Let's do it again. Let's do it. I said, okay, I've seen enough of this. I think I'm, but it gives you a real appreciation for things we take for granted, things that we, don't seem like a big deal anymore. These spectacular crashes that so much goes into it.
Let's wrap, Jim, with another baseball story. Let's go back. I know we talked a little bit about this in the beginning, but one of our colleagues mentioned the fact that to this day, when you go to travel into a city, if there's a baseball stadium nearby, especially Major League, you're there. You go to the games wherever you are.
Right. I love stadiums. I love football stadiums and baseball stadiums. And so when I go to a town, even if I can't attend a game, sometimes like in San Francisco, I got a tour of the Giants ballpark there, that beautiful ballpark on the water. I'm fascinated by stadiums. I love pictures of stadiums. And so when I go to a town, I want to see where the teams play. So yeah, it's a big passion of mine.
Yeah. And you've got a big treat coming up as part of your semi-retirement gift. You get to throw out the first pitch at a Cubs game. How awesome is that?
Well, that is awesome and a little intimidating. You threw out a first pitch at the White Sox stadium. So, and you and I threw the ball around before you did that. So you owe me one now. Got to throw the ball around with you because I'm not going out there without warming up.
You got it. You and I'll look forward to that. Jim, listen, I have been fortunate to have worked beside some icons and legends in this market, and I count you right up at the top there. And I really, truly consider myself fortunate to have spent the last 3 years of your full-time career together and sharing a section of the newsroom with you and tapping into your wisdom. I've always been impressed with your work ethic and just your kindness and your commitment to the job. I still think, every time I would walk by your desk, you were consuming something, whether it was a book or whether it was a show online or whether it was an interview. Every time I walked by, you were consuming content. And I always respected that. And I love you, Jim.
Me too. I love you too, Joe. And thank you for those kind words. The feeling is mutual, and it's been a pleasure working with you, and our friendship continues.
It does. Jim, thanks so much for the time. It's great to see you again. We'll see you in the newsroom soon, huh?
Great to see you, Joe. Thanks so much.
My thanks to Jim for the time, the stories, and the camaraderie over the years. We will miss his daily presence in our newsroom for sure. Brian Griggs with Brian Griggs Productions provides the audio editing for Chicago Unscripted. Ellie Coder edits our social media content. The music is an original score from Chicago vibraphonist Thaddeus Tukes. Bill Curtis is kind enough to lend his legendary voice to the introduction. I'm Joe Donlon. I will see you on CBS News Chicago. It's available everywhere on the CBS News app. My thanks to the network brass and my bosses at CBS News Chicago for their support of this project. And as always, I thank you for listening to Chicago Unscripted.